Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this joint World Trade Center Utah and Salt Lake Chamber member briefing. My name is Jonathan Friedman. I'm President and CEO of World Trade Center Utah. Lots to cover in a half an hour, so we want to get right to it. We've seen some retaliatory efforts from China that we're going to be talking about after the tariffs announced on April 2nd. We're really privileged to have Troy Keller here with us. He'll be our facilitator today. Troy is an attorney with Dorsey and Whitney and is the World Trade Center Utah International Trade and Commercial Policy Advisor. He also co-chairs the Salt Lake Chamber Public Policy Committee. So thank you, Troy, for being with us. We have Ben Collender also from World Trade Center Utah here to advise us. So Troy, I'll kick it to you.
Jonathan, thank you so much, and really thanks to both the Chamber and World Trade Center Utah for the leadership they're providing for our community right now. It's greatly needed and greatly appreciated. And as everyone, to say the obvious, everyone knows the economic landscape is constantly evolving, and the last few days have been great evidence of that. In many ways, coming in with the unfortunate side if you're looking at the stock market. That's why the Salt Lake Chamber and World Trade Center Utah have launched this exclusive member-only trade briefing series to keep us all informed and equipped to navigate emerging challenges and opportunities. From the Chamber's perspective, the goal is to advocate for Utah businesses and provide the insights and tools that businesses need to stay ahead in an ever-changing policy environment. At World Trade Center Utah, we exist to help Utah businesses succeed in the global marketplace, and we do so through a variety of resources and programming. This includes monitoring and identifying strategies to manage changes in our economic environment. Today, of course, we're focused on the latest tariff announcements by the Trump administration. And our presenter is Ben Collender, Chief of Staff for World Trade Center Utah. He will provide an update on recent trade developments, key implementations for businesses, and an overview of World Trade Center Utah's new tariff dashboard, which tracks policy actions in real time. Following his presentation, we'll open the floor for some Q&A. Please submit questions anytime using the Q&A function. So if you have those now at the top of your mind, go ahead and start putting those in, and we'll be ready to address those. One last quick note, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Chamber's website afterwards. With that, let's dive in, and Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Troy. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Is that showing up for everybody?
Looks great.
Great. So first of all, I'm going to be updating from World Trade Center Utah's tariff dashboard. So if you can see the web address up top, it's just wtcutah.com/tariffs. So here at World Trade Center Utah, we see these updates constantly happening on tariffs. If you just scroll down, you can see the list of different announcements from the U.S. government, and whether it's an announcement, an executive order, a federal register, or a customs notice that goes out. Each one of these things has different meaning and level of technical detail to it. And so what we did was compiled all of those for each of the orders, so you can see sort of the status of what an announcement might be and whether it's being implemented. So these are organized by the last action, but you can also see it has an effective date section to it as well. But I'm just going to hone in. You can see there's a list of about 14 different orders that have come out in this administration. I'm going to focus primarily on the top 4 right here. So these are actions that took place on April 2nd. Or implementation thereafter from the announcements on April 2nd. So the first 4 I'm going to go into just very briefly are the automobile and automobile parts tariff. So this is an additional 25% on any foreign car maker. This was announced before April 2nd, but the implementation was set into motion on April 3rd. And announced again on April 2nd. Also, there was, just a blanket. I'll skip down to the 3rd and come back up. There was a blanket 10% on all countries. And if you're paying attention and counting the countries in detail, like we did, you'll find that the full list of countries comes to something like 185. So you may scratch your head and say, what countries are missing in the full list if you click the announcement link. The EU is sort of one broad umbrella in the country announcement, as well as Canada and Mexico were left off. And so there are a few things like that because there are already tariffs that are being considered that are specified with Canada and Mexico. So that's a blanket 10%, but in tandem with that 10%, and this is the section right above, is or right below, sorry, there is a consideration for what the administration is calling unfair trading practices. So this could be reciprocal tariffs that were prior to April 2nd, or tariffs or non-tariff barriers. And the calculation on this really goes into our trade balance with foreign partners. And you see there's a full list of varying tariffs that are above the 10% for all kinds of different countries. One to speak briefly about is China. They were at 34%. You saw, and this is on top of the previously announced 20% tariffs, which you can see down below right here on this 10%, and there's an additional 10% right here as well. And then there's a 34% right here in this section. So these tariffs in some cases stack and in some cases do not. And as you can imagine, this gets really complex really quickly, depending on where you're importing from and what item you're importing. So we have all these details captured here in the dashboard so that those could be explored. We saw this morning as well that China retaliated with an additional 34%, as Jonathan mentioned earlier. So you're going to see this either escalate or de-escalate, and that's really up in the air on the responses. But based on the calculation that the Trump administration has put out through USTR, the US's response is an additional tariff on top of the Chinese tariff, as you can imagine. So this is going to become really complicated in terms of what is the tariff rate today, what is the tariff rate tomorrow, and we're going to continue to track that through our dashboard. So the last item I'm going to touch on, so that was 3, auto, the blanket 10%, and then the variable percentage from country, depending on what their trade barriers are for the United States. The last item I'm going to cover briefly is de minimis. So this was an executive order that wasn't mentioned too much in the announcement on April 2nd, but an executive order was signed that covered de minimis. And this has been a long-standing conversation that World Trade Center Utah has been involved with as well, and that we're pulled into from the point of view of some of the harm that foreign e-commerce platforms going direct to consumers are having on U.S. businesses. So this, in some ways, I don't want to say good, bad right now. We're just looking at it very objectively to say, look, this one in particular on de minimis, we've heard may be helpful in some ways. What it really does is for goods that come in on Temu or Shein, let's take an example, say it's a t-shirt that is $5 on Temu or Shein, you're now paying either $25 or 30%, whichever is higher. So in that instance where you just bought a $5 t-shirt, you're paying $30 for that t-shirt with the landed cost of the package. So if you're buying something for $1,000, well, 30% is going to be higher. So then that's going to be a $300 surcharge on the import from well, that wouldn't really apply because of $800 de minimis, but you get the point. So anyway, I'm going to stop there. And Troy, I don't know if we have any questions, but this is a quick run through of the dashboard, some of the announcements that we're tracking from April 2nd. And I do want to bridge into some of the policy paper discussions, but maybe I'll pause for a second to see if we have any questions, particularly on the dashboard or some of the announcements.
Yeah, so there is a comment on the. I think there are a couple of questions we can get to maybe after you've gone through the rest of the presentation, but there is a specific one to dashboard. Samantha Gellert asks, would it be helpful to have a stat column that adds up all the tariffs to give current tariff percentages? So I think that's that's a nice question just on the presentation format. I know that sometimes it's hard to do because they stack in some cases, not in others. So anyway, what do you think on that one, Ben?
Yeah, it's interesting. We kick this around a little bit, and maybe at some point that will be I understand the value that would provide, and the answer is maybe. However, one of the things to consider is that these tariffs are also captured by HTS code in many cases. So you're not just overlaying the country on that calculation, but you're overlaying a particular part sometimes, or exempting a particular part. So for every reason that may simplify things, it may also make things quite a bit more complicated.
It'd be an elaborate matrix by the time you're done, I imagine.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Great. So we're going to go from the tariff dashboard, where, just as a reminder, if you're looking for the updates, we update that real time. So if you're looking for the latest information that we're tracking, as soon as we get it, we're updating the dashboard. The second thing, we're here to talk about is, what we've heard from Utah businesses relating to these tariffs. So World Trade Center Utah came together with the chamber as soon as, it was late last year, early this year, before the administration really kicked off. We knew tariffs were going to be a big part of the discussion looking forward. So we convened a group of businesses and performed a survey to really start to get a feel for how the impact is hitting Utah businesses and what that means for, any policy considerations that we can work with the chamber on, or any just measuring impact to be able to communicate resources and what the most appropriate resources are. So the first thing, is that we convene the roundtable. We also released the survey, and I have to say the survey data is, it's not perfect because this is a changing situation all the time. But the survey window was from January 29th to February 14th. As many can imagine, that survey information quickly can become outdated, but it's important to keep in mind that the context and the window of that survey. So the biggest thing that we have right here in this section, based on the survey impact, is this is important because it's not always in line with what we're hearing in some of the policy discussions right now. So we're hearing, well, maybe it's confusing of whether tariffs are going to be inflationary or not. Well, we got some feedback from companies on that and how they deal with these added costs. Granted, this was before the April 2nd announcement, but even with, some of the saber rattling early on in January, what we heard was, 76 out of 100 respondents are actually more concerned over U.S. Imposed tariffs than foreign national imposed export tariffs. We also heard, as you can see here, that some of the economic impact would be $150 million in paused or canceled investments just from the 100 companies that we heard from on the survey. 30% of businesses responded that these tariffs would significantly reduce revenues for their business, and on and on and on. You could see the different data points here, but our main takeaway is that these tariffs are going to have significant impacts, and this was prior to April 2nd. So you can only imagine that these tariffs are going to have even more significant impacts than some of the data captured here in our survey. But one of the biggest items is we tried to package themes that we heard from businesses in case studies or in some of the other feedback. Really, what captures the sentiment we heard most is that, it sounds like these tariffs are promoted as great. They're going to increase the revenue for the United States. Maybe there's like a short impact or, but the reality is the risks of these tariffs are quite high. And we received several cases and examples of how. One example is if you're importing equipment across the border, some companies were even of the assumption until some of the tariffs hit in early March or February as well, that these tariffs, look, they ordered their equipment last year, these tariffs don't count. It's when it crosses the border and clears customs in the United States that these tariffs are enacted. So the risk is, for example, if you're importing equipment, say it's a $4 million piece of equipment, that's going to have in some cases, a $1 million tariff if there's a 25% tariff. The hard thing for especially small businesses is going to be, how do you finance that? How do you finance that $1 million? Because you already financed the equipment and now you've got to get it cleared out of customs into your shop to even produce the revenue. It changes your whole operating and cash flow models in a lot of situations. So, there are substantial risks to this. Another thing driving the feedback we heard was uncertainty. So, the fact that there is no understanding of what tomorrow may look like compared to today makes it really hard to do purchase orders or do anything but source from the United States right now. However, the challenge is supply chains are not necessarily stood up in the United States, and that's going to take time to pivot. So that goes back to some of the global competitiveness and what it's going to take for the United States to pivot to this. And the reality is that some of the competitiveness is going to, in adjusting for supply chains, is going to be hampered by these tariffs. So if you have imports to construction or other things, or housing for workforce, you're going to face some real headwinds on the ability to adjust for supply chains. So those are the main three takeaways that we had from our survey. And this paper isn't completely releasable yet. We have to do a couple of adjustments on some case studies to better anonymize the case studies. But at a high level, those are the key findings, some of the inputs, and we'll share this widely with the group once it's available and we've worked to publicly release some of the case studies. I know we have about 12 minutes left. I just want to pause again, Troy, see if we have any questions based on the high-level survey information and key findings of the paper.
Yeah, I don't see any specific to the paper, but there are a number of questions that have come in.
Sure, maybe we can tag
go to
team
those.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Well, and first, Ben, thanks. That was super insightful. I know you and the team have been living this and just receiving feedback from businesses nonstop, really for a few months now. So I think a lot of that came through, and how knowledgeable and how much perspective you have on all this. So let's take some more advantage of that here in the next few minutes. First, let's start. There are a couple of questions that are, I would say, kind of technical ones that would be good. I think a lot of people probably are thinking some of those. So one of those is just on the stacking. The question is can you clarify if this is from Scott Holmes. Hey, Scott, the 10% base tariff stack with the new 34% China tariffs? So he says, I know the earlier 20% does stack, but what about the new 10% base tariff that hit the 180 countries? Go ahead, Ben.
So that's a great question. So the 10% base is the minimum threshold for the wider variable. So we separated it into two sections because the thought is that the additional tariffs may go down or up in quick fashion depending on responses. So the 10%, to answer the question, the 10% and the 34% are the same for China. It's just a 10% minimum, but we've separated it on our dashboard.
Good. Yeah, the way I understood that is that on the retaliatory tariffs, no country escaped with less than 10%, but then yeah, each country would have its own. And in addition to that, they don't add up. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so that example, the original 10 The additional 10 on China, this could be weird to try and explain because China originally had 20% before 2 sets of 10 before April 2nd, but then on April 2nd, there was 34, which included the baseline 10. So total was 54, and we'll see where it goes to after China's announcement today on the retaliatory 50 or 34.
Yeah, I think everyone needs to appreciate China is, is in a different bucket from everywhere else. And a lot of this trade war, to the extent it escalates, which it seems to be happening today, is going to, it's going to be focused on China. And that, and there was a while that administration at one point was saying we're going to do a 10% every month until things get better. We'll see if that plays out, but I think there will be a reaction to what China just did today. So here's another one that is a great question. Abby Barraclaw asks, do we anticipate any exemptions?
That is a good question. I would say writ large, we've heard, and Troy, I would love to hear your opinion on this as well. The narrative has been pretty strong of do not expect any exemptions. But we've also heard some folks in DC starting to collect exemptions. So I've heard a little bit of both, but mainly that anything requesting exemptions in DC is dead on arrival. That's a lot of what I've heard, but I've heard mixed opinions on this. I will say in some of the executive orders that went out on April 2nd, there were exemptions mentioned in the executive order that went out on the blanket tariffs, the blanket global tariffs. But those exemptions, for the most part, were considering previous tariffs that were already in place. So, for example, steel and aluminum already tariffed with 232 tariffs that were mentioned separately, or some of the energy or critical minerals were exempted from some of those wider considerations. But there's a list on the tariff dashboard of what those exemptions are, and we're tracking them in the executive orders as well. So as we see them, we will mention them. But in terms of advocacy, I'm curious your thoughts because I've heard dead on arrival.
Yes, so I like the way you framed it. There were exemptions in the executive order, even though they said there would be no exemptions. And lumber was another one of those, which I think is important for our construction industry.
Right.
So here's my view on that: is there will not be an exemption process. So last time around with the 301s, as a lot of companies are aware, there's this exemption process you can go through. You could apply directly to USTR and say, hey, I've got this product. Here's why that I import it. Here's why it's strategic for the US. We shouldn't put the tariff on it. There's a reasonably good chance that that exemption would be allowed. They're not going to do that. I'd be surprised if that does come after they've said no so many times. And they say they don't want to hear people lobbying for broader exemptions, but they've been giving them. So I think special circumstances, I think you need to have a heavy amount of advocacy and explain why an exemption would be critical for national security or the economy or whatever. I think those are few and far between, as you just mentioned. There's some pretty big topics like energy and semiconductors, and so I think I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, but there won't be a process like before.
And it may be helpful to mention how we threaded this needle in our white paper that we'll release when it's ready. Is we just did this with case studies, so we didn't have an exemption consideration list, but we just basically compiled the case studies in such a way that if asked, we would respond with, there's a full list of considerations in the case studies that we've collected. If you want to go about exemptions, we can help to pull out some of those details. But, putting it in a sort of consideration portion or starting to have any proactive approach, I would think any narrative or capturing of sentiment would be dead on arrival if we elevated that in some sort of a, hey, here's an exemption request list, right?
Yeah, perfect. Here's one. There's several here that I'm on advocacy. Let's spend a minute on those. But before we get to those, there's one more, I would say, technical question that I think you answered in your presentation, but let's just hit home on it. So Jeff Child asks, what does product that has left the port, how is it affected? And so I think you talked about like equipment purchases, but what about stuff right now? That some of the tariffs come into play tomorrow, or actually land tomorrow or early next week. What about just a shipload of t-shirts that's on its way? It's going to hit the ports end of next week. Those obviously were shipped before the tariffs were put in place, and the contract to buy them was done before then. What happens in that circumstance, Ben?
So this gets into some really detailed pieces of the executive order, because there are sometimes, and it varies, in transit exemptions mentioned. And this goes down into the details of, when I scrolled through the dashboard, there were several levels of resources, starting from the announcement to the executive order, to the Federal Register, to the Customs Service messaging system. That bottom link is going to be your best clarifying piece. It's the final say on all these things from customs point of view. That is one nuance that sometimes there's some space for if there's an in-transit exemption, but I have to say, I've been a part of a couple of federal policy groups, and those are really sometimes kind of messy to pull apart, and you may have to rely on your attorney or reach out to us if you don't have one, and we're happy to connect you with a good resource there.
Then maybe we have time for, I'm going to try to pull a few of these questions into one, since we probably have time just to have a discussion about one more. Some questions go to like, how long do we expect the situation to continue? What will the reaction of, what's next? Are these fixed? Will the White House change their mind or negotiate with other countries? And I'm going to try to mush it together. And if there is going to be some of that happening, what are we doing to communicate with our elected officials, including with respect to the white paper that has been put together?
Troy, maybe you can get out your crystal ball on this one too, and we can have them back and forth. I mean, the crystal ball on this one is really tough, but I think one of the things that we learned from April 2nd is, if we were hoping that these would de-escalate immediately, I think those hopes are gone, and that we can expect, at least for the short to medium term, that the tariffs will probably go up, but that's going to be dependent on retaliatory measures by other countries. Countries are going to react differently, so it's going to be a varied approach, is what I would estimate. If a country retaliates with more tariffs, we're going to retaliate with more. If they're going to drop and come in with discussions about further reducing tariffs and barriers to trade, that would be something the administration would entertain and probably bring down tariffs. So what I guess the guidance would be is, depending on the country that you're most reliant on or working with, monitoring the situation, the policy, the retaliatory response from the country that you're working in or working with, and seeing what that looks like would be the best, because it's going to be varied by country in all reality. I will say some of the findings in terms of, I think what we heard is, like, certainty is really helpful for businesses. If you're procuring something from a year ago, and all of a sudden you're going to be hit with $1 million tariff fee before you can clear it out of customs, that's not very predictable in terms of your bottom line. That certainty and timeline for when a tariff is implemented is really important, and also how in the world to finance it, maybe amortizing these tariffs. Like, I think the question shifts to, can we make them go away? Probably not. That's going to be dependent on foreign country and decisions, but how to actually effectively navigate this, knowing that these may be coming, is the bigger question. On, maybe don't have a tariff that's implemented right away, because companies are hit with that in a way that they may not be able to recover from.
I love that. The different types of advocacy. One is saying, please don't, or please change what you're doing. Another is, just give us some time to get ready for it.
Right.
I think there's room for both. We're at the top of the hour. So I hope people found this valuable. I'm sure you did. And just as kind of a departing thought, these half an hour calls, we're going to do them each week. And the goal is both to disseminate information, but also to collect the information for the chamber and World Trade Center as part of these information advocacy efforts they're doing with our elected officials. So this is kind of a key process. We're glad again for everyone joining. We hope to see you next week. Thanks very much.